I wanted to get your appraisal specifically on the state of immigration in Britain.
We're in the last chance saloon. I mean, the country now is basically undergoing a pace and scale of change it's never seen before in its history. We are adding a city, basically the size of Bristol, to the UK population every year. Foreign nationals in this country are 3.5 times more likely than Brits to be arrested for rape and sexual offences. Specific groups are up to 20 times more likely than the British people to be arrested for those offences. It's just the beginning. They're gaslighting the British people. The likes of Deliveroo and Just Eat, who are allowing illegal migrants in this country to rent passes to deliver food. And even worse, this is the most outrageous part of this. Keir Starmer and the Labour government are actually using British taxpayers' money to bankroll private companies to offer more favourable contracts to landlords who take in illegal migrants and asylum seekers over the British people. We want an immediate end to this experiment.
Civil war might be on the horizon.
The wheels are in motion, as those factors are now very visible in the UK. So let me be very, very clear. We are tolerating people who, in the end, will not tolerate us.
Before you hear from Matt Goodwin, I ask, if you want to support this show, all you have to do is press subscribe. If you do that, I can have more phenomenal guests like Matt Goodwin exploring the issues you want to hear about that the mainstream media won't touch. And if you head over to winstonmarshall.co.uk, not only will you get ad-free viewing, but you'll have an extended conversation between me and Matt taking your questions. Matt, welcome back to the show. Thanks for coming in.
Thanks for having me.
Host of the wildly popular Matt Goodwin Substack with a focus on immigration, which is exactly what we're going to talk about today, tying it in with the 1-year anniversary of Sir Keir Starmer coming to government, July 4th, 2024. I wanted to get your appraisal specifically on the state of immigration in Britain today. So perhaps before we dive into the details, you can set it out as you see it.
Well, I think in terms of immigration in the UK more generally, we're obviously, we're in the last chance saloon. I mean, the country now is basically undergoing a pace and scale of change it's never seen before in its history. And I think the British people are much more concerned about this transformation of their country than the political class in Westminster recognises. I think there is a real palpable sense of urgency and concern outside of London, Oxford and Cambridge and Brighton that the politicians have not really reckoned with. So my default view is, we really have two big problems in this country. One is the social contract between the people who are running the country and the people who are having to live with the consequences of their decisions. I think that social contract is starting to break down. But I think we also have an enormous cultural problem in this country, which is about the downstream effects of mass uncontrolled immigration and broken borders, which I think is going to stretch the social fabric in this country in a very different way and make it very difficult to unite the people of these islands and actually keep this country together over the longer term. So we can get into both of those.
We'll definitely get into the demographic thing. And interestingly, I've seen that the people on the British left are arguing that immigration is saving our demographic crisis. So it'd be interesting to get into why you think they're wrong. But just to push back on you, so firstly, on you mentioned the change. It is the case that net migration has massively plummeted. The numbers are down to something like 450, 500,000. Now, that's still astronomical, but that is significantly down from its peak, the net migration 900, 950 under, was it Rishi? So there is a change. Now, why that change has happened, it would be interesting to hear what you say about that. Starmer and his government are saying it's because of them. I'm not totally convinced about that. But that also it ties in with your second point about the Westminster bubble and the kind of people here in the halls of power not caring about immigration, but it actually seems like they are doing, or at least saying they're doing things. For another example would be that Labour in May issued a white paper with their outline about what they're going to do about immigration.
No. I mean,
but and even this week have said they're finally going to try and do things to control immigration a bit more. So to say that they don't acknowledge there's a problem with immigration doesn't seem to add up with what they're saying. What they're saying might be different to what they're doing. Do you see what I say?
Nobody's controlling migration in this country to the extent that the British people want it controlled. That is the fundamental point. We are still living in the middle of a mass uncontrolled immigration experiment, which is exactly what it is. It is an experiment. It has never been done before in our history, nowhere near this scale. And the vast majority of hardworking, tax-paying, law-abiding people out there in this country want that experiment to end. It's very clear what the British people want. Two things are happening at the same time. The political class has completely lost control of our borders. Illegal migration, the small boat crossings, have never been as high as they are today after not just 1 year of a Labour government, but actually after a succession of uniparty governments on both the left and the right who haven't taken border security seriously. More than 170,000, mainly young men, often from Islamic nations. We don't know who they are. We don't know what they believe, are coming into our country on the small boats. We know they have included Iranian terrorists. We know they have included rapists. And we know they have been organized by people smugglers who have been openly sharing ISIS propaganda. We should declare a state of national emergency and do whatever we need to do to control the borders. And we can come back and talk about that.
Yeah.
The second thing that is happening at the same time as that is we have a mass legal immigration policy, which has been ushering in millions of people into this country, most of whom are low-skill, low-wage workers from outside of Europe. 81% of all migration into the UK now is coming from outside of European nations, from culturally different, if not incompatible nations, Afghanistan, Iraq, Eritrea, Syria, Pakistan, could go on, China, that I am arguing is now actually undermining the foundations of this country. Those two things are happening at the same time. Most Brits out there want both of those things to stop. They would be broadly comfortable over the longer term with a net migration rate of somewhere between 0 and 50,000 high-skill migrants from culturally compatible nations. Not what we have now, which is masses of low-skill, low-wage migration from outside of Europe. And you say the numbers are coming down. Well, look, if I was debating Keir Starmer, I would say, why is it that net migration into this country is still higher than it was at the time of the vote for Brexit, which was specifically driven by a desire to lower net migration? At that point, it was around 330,000. It's now about 450,000, which means, Winston, we are adding a city, basically the size of Bristol, to the UK population every year, while also thinking we can solve things like the housing crisis and we can deliver a prosperous economy. It's absolutely bananas. The argument for mass migration is falling apart economically, culturally, socially. The evidence is not there to support this project. We can get into that. And I think the British people are basically saying very loudly, in a very clear way, we want an immediate end to this experiment. We want an immediate end to mass uncontrolled legal migration, and we want our borders fixed.
Ever had that sinking feeling when you reach checkout and realize you might be overpaying? Well, that's exactly why I recommend Coupert, an AI-powered super shopping assistant offering 3 tools to help you with your online shopping and help you save money. Firstly, Coupert is a free browser extension that automatically finds the best coupon codes for you. No more searching, no more guessing, just click and it tests every code it can find and instantly saving you money. Secondly, Coupert also gives you cash back at over 76,000 stores, places like Walmart, Nike, and even Amazon. You activate it, shop as usual, and Coupert sends you money back through a PayPal gift card or even straight to your bank. Simple as that. And here's the final and third tool. Coupert compares prices across the internet in real time, so you know if you're getting the best deal or if someone else is offering it cheaper. Coupert has over 8 million people already using it. So if you're tired of paying full price, click the link in the description. Install Coupert to your browser and start saving today. Smarter shoppers use Coupert, and remember, by supporting my sponsors, you are supporting this show. So you've mentioned 170,000 there for border crossings. Sorry, that's presumably channel crossings.
Small boats.
Small boat crossings. Over what period?
Since 2018.
Since 2018. And how many since Starmer's come?
Since
power?
we've had 20,000 this year alone in 2025, and we're forecast to reach over 50,000. So the small boat crossings this year are up 50% on the year before Labour took power, and they're up 80% on 2023. In other words, the illegal migration crisis, the border crisis, is getting worse, not better. Why? Well, not only because nobody in Westminster is willing to do what needs to be done, and I can tell you what needs to be done, but Keir Starmer removed the Rwanda plan, the only deterrent we had. Labour decriminalised illegal migration. They decided that they would put illegal migrants in hotels and accommodation in the heart of British communities, in the very heart of British neighbourhoods.
That was already happening,
They would have
though, wasn't
detained to some extent, but what Labour are doing, not many people know this, what Labour are doing is they are approving the vast majority of asylum claims that are being made in this country, often by people who have come here illegally. And then they're saying to the British people, they're lying to the British people, by the way. They are saying, well, we are returning more people than ever. And actually what they're doing is they're approving the vast majority of asylum claims that are being made here. They're putting those people into private accommodation at the cost of £15 billion over the next decade. And even worse, this is the most outrageous part of this. Keir Starmer and the Labour government are actually using British taxpayers' money to bankroll private companies like Serco to offer more favourable contracts to landlords who take in illegal migrants and asylum seekers over the British people. Let me just be clear as to what I'm saying. The British state is using the British people's money to outbid the British people in their own housing market. How is that fair? How is that just? How is that right? The British people believe in fairness. They believe in a sense of fair play. You come here, you respect the laws, right? What is happening in this country is absolutely absurd. Of course, people are coming. More people are coming than ever because Keir Starmer has basically put a bright, flashing neon sign on the White Cliffs of Dover saying, come on in. We'll give you a smartphone, a cash card, place on the NHS, private place in local schools, private accommodation. We'll give you nice housing. Will basically incentivize you to come rather than provide deterrence. And that's why the crisis is now getting a lot worse.
Have you got a number on the asylum claims being approved?
So Labour are approving somewhere between 60 and 75% of asylum claims in this country.
Do we know how many claims are being made?
I'd need to look up the exact figure, but it's record. I mean, basically, we've got record numbers of asylum applications. The backlog has never been as big as it's been in recent years. And what Labour are doing are just basically stamping claims saying approve, 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 you can stay. And then they're returning, 7,000, 8,000 people and say, well, look, the returns have never been bigger. But they're gaslighting the British people. And Winston, I'm very concerned because if more than 50,000 illegal migrants are going to come in the rest of 2025, which is the forecast, what on earth is this country going to look like as we get closer to the 2029 general election, with Labour refusing to actually do what needs to be done to fix the borders? I think Keir Starmer has completely lost control of this issue. He doesn't get it. It's a national security issue, and it needs to be dealt with urgently.
Yeah. So let's hone in then on the channel crossings, right? So you've said some of the numbers, and you have also suggested that the reason it's increased is because Starmer put the kibosh on the Rwanda deal program.
That's one of the reasons.
That's one of the reasons. What are the other reasons?
We're soft touch. Our welfare regime is basically way too generous. We allow anybody who makes it here illegally to stay in the country. There was an interesting investigation by the Sun newspaper recently where a journalist posed as an illegal migrant from Afghanistan, and within minutes was delivering takeaways for Just Eat. We have an economy that allows illegal migrants to basically work in the black economy. We have a political system that gives people incentives to come over. Thomas Sowell once said, immigration laws are the only laws that are ever discussed in terms of how to help people break them. And that is exactly what is happening today. Starmer, the Tories too, by the way, they completely failed on this issue. We have a political system that is allowing people to break our laws. So we become a soft touch. Do you think for a second this would happen in Arab states? That people would allow this degree of law breaking?
Well, it happened in America
place
under Biden. But maybe we can talk about how Trump's success and failures dealing with it might guide us in Britain. But just so your argument then for Starmer being encouraging the border crossings is that there are incentives on the other side once they get here, as well as the Rwanda deal. Is that have I understood
we
your
don't
position?
detain and deport. We should be detaining and deporting everybody who arrives here illegally, and we should be processing them offshore, which is what the Rwanda plan was going to do. The problem with the Rwanda plan is it didn't quite establish the supremacy of UK law. Some of those illegal migrants could have still claimed against it using European conventions and laws. My argument is, if you arrive illegally, detain, deport. If you're already here illegally, deport. That is a policy, by the way, supported by the vast majority of British people. Everybody in Westminster will raise their hands and say, oh my God, I can't believe what Matt Goodwin's just said. We need to be deporting all of these people. Who on earth supports that? 81% of Brits in a survey just said they want all foreign criminals removed from the UK. We have over 10,000 foreign criminals in our prisons. The British public are way more on side with this than their politicians would like to think.
Okay, so deport to where?
Well, firstly, those that we can deport back to their countries of origin, we do so. Take an example like Pakistani Muslim rape gang members, dual nationals who are here, who have broken our laws, go back to Pakistan. If Pakistan doesn't take them, we use visa penalties, we start using foreign aid. We say, well, why are we giving you £133 million in a year? Why are we giving you this many visas? If you're not going to take back these guys, well, we're going to start playing hardball, which is actually, by the way, is what Trump is doing. So we should not be having people coming into our country breaking our laws. They need to go. So in order to So
countries that we are paying foreign aid to, we would use that as
leverage
against them and say you have to take them.
That's one of the things we can do.
What are the other ways?
I would argue what we are basically going to need in this country, what all of this is building up to, is a complete reshaping of the institutional legal architecture that surrounds our political system. We need to leave the European Convention on Human Rights, the ECHR, so we can deport foreign criminals and we can deport illegal migrants who are currently using Articles 3 and 8 of the ECHR to stay in the country. As a consequence of that, we need to reform Tony Blair's Human Rights Act, which entrenches the ECHR into domestic UK law. We need to radically reform the welfare regime, so we are not a soft touch for people who break our laws. And we need to establish a new principle in this country, which is what I would call a principle of national preference. It is the hard-working, law-abiding, tax-paying British people who are put first, not people who break our laws and have only been in the country for 2 minutes. It's that principle of national preference, treating taxpayers, treating citizens with the respect they deserve. I'm going to give you one example. You tell me, Winston, how is it right or fair that we have just heard about a case to do with an Albanian criminal, drug dealer, robber, thief, has 50 convictions, 50 convictions, was imprisoned in Italy, came to the UK, and then used our immigration tribunal system to stay in the UK. Why is that person in our country? Why is our immigration system and why are our judges and lawyers working to keep those people in our country? And, there are horrific examples. I could give you dozens of examples, but the one that sticks in my mind is the Afghan illegal migrant who came to the UK, told state authorities he was 14 years of age, was put into a local secondary school alongside British children. Even a dentist at the time was saying, there's no way this guy's 14. Turns out he was 19 and had already killed 2 men in, I think it was Serbia, and went on to kill a young lad, British lad called Thomas Roberts, who was an aspiring Marine. He wanted to join the Marines. And in Bournemouth, this Afghan illegal migrant killed Thomas Roberts with a machete. Why are these people in our country? That's my view. Why are these people in our country? If we do not control the borders and stop these people from coming in, the social contract will break down. And that's my bigger concern, that actually this isn't really about illegal migration in that sense. It is about the social contract whereby people are willing to trust the system. They're willing to pay into the system, to pay tax, to do their bit, to contribute to the collective pot. If you keep subjecting the British people to this insanity, to this experiment, they will withdraw their support for the system, which is, by the way, what we saw in the aftermath of Southport. That is what we saw in the aftermath of the Southport atrocities, where basically there wasn't an organised far-right conspiracy. As we now know from the police constabulary reports, it was actually much more troubling for the establishment. It was organic. It was ordinary men and women protesting about these failing policies of mass uncontrolled immigration, broken borders, all of which have brought the likes of Axel, Ruda Cabana, and many other evil people into our country.
Yeah.
And the Brits have had enough.
We've seen that brewing for a long time. And if you were paying attention, what happened in Knowsley at the beginning of 23 was that there was someone caught, a migrant from a migrant hotel was caught on video making a pass at a young teenage local girl, and the police failed to deal with it, and then riots broke out. That was exact precursor to what happened in 2024, a month after Starmer came to power. It's like the utter failure to deal with this situation. All these migrants get dumped in the most deprived parts of Britain, and it's, as you say, mainly men, and they do all sordid things with young girls.
Here's the important point many people out there won't realise. It's not just these isolated examples. The evidence now shows that mass uncontrolled immigration is driving crime. We know, thanks to freedom of information requests that have been submitted by independent campaigners, that foreign nationals in this country are twice as likely as Brits to be arrested and convicted of crimes, and are 3.5 times more likely than Brits to be arrested for rape and sexual offences. We know that from freedom of information requests. Afghans, Eritreans, specific groups are up to 20 times more likely than the British people to be arrested for those offences. Now, so here's my question. I have 2 questions for the state. One, why are you not releasing this information to people? Why is it taking independent campaigners to submit freedom of information requests? Because you tell us we're misinformed. Keir Starmer tells us it's misinformation. Yvette Cooper tells us it's disinformation. Well, if you're accusing people of that while simultaneously refusing to share information about what is actually happening in British society, that is deeply unfair and hypocritical. Let's get all the data onto the table, because the data that we have, the information that we have, shows that mass immigration is driving crime. It shows that mass immigration is bad for the economy. It's taking more out of the collective pot than it's putting in. Even the Office for Budget Responsibility now quietly accepts that. And so what I think we have in this country is a political and expert class that views pro-immigration, their support for mass immigration, as a religion. They are basically fanatical about it, even when the evidence shows very clearly this policy is driving up crime, driving up rents and property prices, driving up poverty and making our economy weaker, and also making the social contract, the social fabric weaker and more vulnerable. Somebody just needs to be real with the British people about it. We need a politics that reflects the fact that this policy no longer makes any sense.
So I've got an idea about why it is that the government and the Westminster classes want to hide this information. Forgetting about, just leaving aside for one moment their ideology about mass migration and the sort of globalist mindset, but why is it that they're hiding information like this? And if you saw in Germany, one German politician, I think, got certainly booked, but maybe even prison time for releasing data on Afghan rapes within Germany. But my theory is that after the war, 1947 is the beginning of mass migration into Britain. And famously, that's the date of the Windrush first coming here, but actually there were a lot more Europeans coming here. And within 10 years, you have the first race riots in Britain.
Yeah,
Nottingham and Notting Hill. And over this, and then you have the British Nationality Act, you have the Race Relations Act, and the Race Relations Act, I think, is just after Notting Hill. But essentially, the Race Relations Act is the beginning of this, not just accretion of acts and laws to deal with the social problems of different groups living amongst each other, but it also breeds the culture. So then there's this culture of like, we have to we have to deal with the best way to deal with the problem of these different groups coming together is acts and kind of hiding the truth about what's going on.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It's controlling the supply of information. That's what's happening. So we now have a layer of censorship that is put on top of our immigration debate. Okay, so non-crime hate incidents, right, where people are basically warned off talking about issues to do with migration. We have 250,000 of those over the last decade. Definitions of Islamophobia. The 2018 definition of Islamophobia signed off by the Labour Party and Liberal Tories specifically mentioned discussing the rape gangs and Muslim entryism into the institutions as examples of Islamophobia. The expansion of terms like far right, like hate, all of this is designed to discredit and delegitimize people like me from entering into this conversation and challenging the status quo. People have to understand that is basically what this is about. You saw it most notably after Southport, when Keir Starmer basically said, if you're asking questions about why these people are in your country or mass immigration, you're far right. If you ask questions about the rape gang inquiry, you're jumping on the bandwagon of the far right, or you're blowing a dog whistle, as Labour MP Lucy Powell said.
Yeah.
This is the dominant mindset on the left. So they're trying to control the supply of information and narrow the public square. The difference today, of course, unlike the 1980s and 90s, is we now have new media. We have shows like this, we have podcasts, we have new television channels, we have Substacks, where you can basically circumvent the legacy institutions. The BBC doesn't control the national conversation anymore, right, in a way that it once did. The legacy institutions don't. Now, that's why the elite class are getting scared. That's why you're seeing the expansion of non-crime hate incidents, parents being arrested by 6 police officers because they're complaining about their school in WhatsApp groups. It's why you're seeing Lucy Connolly going to prison for the best part of 3 years, while 2 young lads, the Singh brothers or relatives in Preston, 2 young delivery drivers who went into the home of a 14-year-old girl and sexually assaulted her, were given 2.5 years. We now live in a society where they get a shorter sentence than somebody like Lucy Connolly, who shares some, challenging, hurty words on Twitter. It's all about trying to control the supply of information because I think the elite class is struggling.
So that's
it's about power.
Yeah, now we're into 2-tier justice in Britain, right? Because they're not just trying to hide things from people. They're actually treating different demographics within Britain completely differently. And
They're trying to manage. They are trying to manage the unmanageable now. That's what it is about. So they are trying to do sort of stakeholder management.
Wait, are you suggesting that they're getting more lenient jail time, prison sentences to people of minority backgrounds?
Well, we know what's happening.
But I know that they're doing it, but are you saying they're doing it because if they keep it down, it will be better for race relations?
It's stakeholder management. They are trying to manage irreconcilable differences among groups. They are trying to, and this will only last for so long, but they are trying to dampen down the tensions by being more favourable and lenient to some groups over others. That's why Labour refused to budge on the rape gangs, because it knew that it would alienate its electoral support among British Muslim communities. It's why Keir Starmer, and to be frank, any mainstream politician is unwilling to have a very frank conversation with the country about mass migration. Even when Keir Starmer gave his Island of Strangers speech, which, by the way, more than half of all British people, according to YouGov, said, yeah, I agree with that.
I think he's backtracked on it.
I agree with that. He's now regretted it. He said, well, actually, I shouldn't have said that, because they are terrified actually of acknowledging the reality that is around them, which is that this experiment is failing and it's dividing our country. And Winston, here's the thing. What we have seen in the UK over the last 20 years is just the beginning. If you look at the forecasts of where we're going, white Britons will be a minority by 2063. That will be much sooner, by the way, among the under 40s, somewhere around 2050. The foreign-born and their immediate children will be a majority by 2079. And we've just had some really shocking statistics that reflect that. 40% of all babies born in England today are born to at least one foreign-born parent.
Yeah, including me, by the way.
And we'll come back and discuss that. And by the end of the century, approaching 1/4 of all people in the UK will be following Islam, and potentially 1/3 of young people. The pace and scale of demographic, cultural, and religious change in this country is going to be like nothing the UK and its people have ever seen before. And I am one of the few people, I think, who's openly saying, I'm very nervous about this because I think this is going to be a disaster unless we change course. I don't think we're going to be able to unify this country. I don't think we're going to be able to uphold the social contract. I don't think people in politics and power are even thinking about what this is really going to mean for our communities and our country. It's not about, race. It is about what makes a viable nation state. Robert Putnam, the Harvard professor, once said, and he showed this empirically, if you subject nation states to rapid demographic change, to large-scale migration, the first thing that goes is social trust. Social trust collapses. People don't become, their trust in the institutions falls off a cliff. And what Putnam said is in that situation, people hunker down. They turn away from their neighbors because suddenly their country doesn't look like their home anymore. It looks like a 2-star cheap motel where people are coming and going and you don't really know your neighbors. You certainly don't have a shared sense of history and collective memory with them. You don't have a shared identity with them. There's no common culture or way of life. Now, in that situation, is it your home anymore? Or is it actually something that you don't really enjoy being in and you certainly don't want your family to be in? Well, I would argue, that's where we're heading, given the underlying demographic changes that are now sweeping through this country.
So people are also suggesting that civil war might be on the horizon. David Getz is a famous proponent.
David Betts.
Is famously had a conversation on Louise Perry's podcast, which went extremely viral, making the case and kind of getting the impression that that's implicit in what you're saying. But maybe I'm wrong. Do you think that's a risk?
Well, what David Betts, and he's a professor, fellow professor, academic, what he's arguing is that actually if you look at the literature and the evidence on civil wars and conflicts in developing nations, where they've been more frequent, more common, if you look at the factors that lead to civil war and conflict, I think I'm right in saying what David is arguing is those factors are now very visible in the UK. And he has said on the record that actually, the wheels are in motion. Things have already gone to such a place that it's going to be very difficult, if not impossible, to pull back. What he's saying is there's a 2-dimensional conflict or challenge that's now going on in this country. On the one hand, you have a fraying relationship between the people in power and the people they claim to represent, right? That the elites no longer really understand or even like the people that live around them, right? They're no longer in touch with the voters. But there's another dimension, which is growing evidence of inter-ethnic conflict. And you saw that during, for example, the riots in Leeds. You saw it in the aftermath of Southport. You see it in the organisation of gang violence in parts of London and elsewhere, even Southend-on-Sea, where you have tribalism, a kind of ethnic mobilisation that you would expect to see in places like Lebanon, not the UK.
Yeah.
Now, I would even add to that by saying, firstly, yes, I think David Betts has a point, but I would add something else to that. People always say to me, well, you talk about the changing demography of the UK. Why do you think it matters? The rise of people who are born outside of the UK, for example. Well, if you look at the most common countries that non-UK born mothers who are having children in the UK are coming from, it's not Australia or Canada. It's not even really Europe. It's places like Iraq, Albania, Afghanistan, Pakistan, culturally different, if not incompatible nations. Why does that matter? Well, academics like Garrett Jones have shown that through migration, you get cultural transplant. So cultures transplant into those nations because migrants often tend to hold on to their cultural norms, their traditions, and their habits and their religious beliefs, and they pass them down to second, third generation. And what Garrett Jones says is, well, look, that can go really well. Sometimes it can have positive effects. It can leave good things, like let's say maybe a controversial point, but the Brits who settled in other nations, actually one of the things they left behind were really strong, well-functioning, effective institutions.
If you look at Hong Kong or Singapore, that totally supports that argument.
Compare that to, say, the Spanish and the Portuguese. Well, when they settled, they left very different things, lower levels of trust, ineffective institutions. But what Garrett Jones, I think, is saying, and what David Betts are saying is, now look at some of the things that are being culturally transplanted into the UK. The Pakistani Muslim rape gangs is the most obvious example, where you have a clan-based network from outside of the UK, deeply misogynistic attitudes towards women and girls being transplanted in. Mm-hmm. What about how folks from parts of Africa are very distrustful of the institutions and have low levels of trust being transplanted in? So if you look at the places that are at the forefront of these changes, so let's take Luton. If you remove London, Luton has the highest share in the entire country of babies who are being born to one or both parents who themselves were born outside of the UK. Here's my question. Do you want the UK, do you want the United Kingdom to look like Luton? That's the question. Everybody now needs to think about that question, because all of the things that you see now unfolding in Luton, in Slough, in parts of London, in Brent, in Ealing, those are now cascading out to other parts of the country that will also experience very similar cultural and demographic changes. Mm-hmm. Now, the left will say, diversity is our strength, migration leads us to paradise. Does Luton look like paradise to you? Does Luton look like the kind of place that you want the UK to look like?
So what would the left? It's not just the left who are saying that. I mentioned Owen Jones earlier, but there are people on the sort of wet conservative side who are also arguing that actually we need migration for the demographic crisis. We need it because of economically. I think you've already argued on the last time you came on this show to discuss it, why it wasn't helping us economically. But when it comes to...
That's an important point, though. Can I just say, since we last had a discussion, the economic case for mass uncontrolled immigration has completely fallen apart. And Keir Starmer's speech on the island of strangers, we're at risk of becoming an island of strangers, was actually quite interesting if you read the small print of that speech and the footnotes, because his advisors are clearly reading the kind of evidence and research that people like me and others are sharing. They clearly know in number 10 Downing Street that this makes no economic sense. Just one stat, just to bring this home. If you look at last year, migration into the UK, we issued around 766,000 visas. What percentage of those went to people who are coming in on high-skilled worker visas? It's about 14%. 14%.
Oh my God.
So the argument in Westminster that, look, we need all of these people to do high-skilled jobs and drive the economy. Actually, if you break the numbers down, Westminster is lying to the rest of the country, because the share of people who are coming in on high-skilled worker visas, or even coming in to be doctors in the NHS, is much lower. It's like 2-3%.
Wait, 2-3% of
all visas are going to doctors in the NHS.
That's really important, right? Because a classic riposte, or sort of progressive riposte to why we need immigration, is that indigenous people don't want to do those jobs.
Yeah, that's nonsense.
But okay, so leaving aside whether or not they do, that breaks down if only 2 or 3% of those coming in are actually prepared to do the nursing doctor jobs, then the whole idea is
and while they're doing that, this is the worst bit. While they're doing that, the system is rejecting every year tens of thousands of hardworking, talented, ambitious British kids who want to go to medical school, who want to serve the National Health Service. Why are they doing that? Because it's cheaper to import less well-qualified doctors from developing nations. That is the reality.
Wait, so sorry, the NHS,
absurd.
The NHS are turning down
medical schools, turning down tens of thousands of British kids every year
because they haven't got the good enough grades.
Because they've got straight A's. They've got straight A. No, it's too expensive.
So big for DEI reasons.
It's expensive to take an A-level student.
Oh, I see.
And turn them into a doctor.
If they take a foreigner, they have to pay.
It's cheaper to bring somebody in from Pakistan or
because they're paying to
or
go
Nigeria or whatever, who has an equivalent qualification, but we know that that equivalent qualification, the pleb, the people who do that sometimes are not as well qualified as their British counterparts. What I'm saying, though, the key point in all of this is we have a system that consistently prioritizes foreigners over British workers and people. The answer to, well, we need migration for jobs, my starting point is, hang on a second, we've got 10 million people in this country on the welfare regime. We've got 1 million young people not in education, employment, training. A responsible leader would say
1 million.
1 million young people not in education, employment, work or training. A responsible leader who cared about the nation would say, we start with that problem, we fix that problem before we just press the mass immigration button. Because what's happened in Westminster is everybody's just doing this. Right? It's like a morphine button. They're just addicted to it. More migration, more migration. Oh, we got a problem. More migration. Meanwhile, we've got our own people on the welfare regime. No meaning, no dignity, no sense of purpose in their lives because nobody can be bothered to stop doing this. And when they do stop doing that, big business comes in, right? Big business comes in and they say, stop, you cannot stop pressing this button because everything will collapse. Well, actually, what they mean is we will have to innovate. We'll have to become more dynamic. We'll have to actually pay people more money. We'll have to build a better economy where we're not just throwing bodies at the economy and telling everybody just keep consuming stuff. That's why we've got no growth. Our growth rate is like 0.5% at the moment. We have an economy that is not growing, massive amounts of debt, no productivity, GDP per capita going the wrong way because there are no incentives in this country for people to innovate and actually deliver prosperity.
Yeah.
And the only people who will deliver that, Winston, they're all leaving.
Yeah.
The millionaires and the wealth creators, we're losing more of those people than any other advanced nation.
Every day I feel like I meet people who tell me they're leaving the country. They're going to America, they're going to Dubai, other places where they can actually build their business.
But this is why I keep talking about the social contract, because if you're a young 30-something or a young 20-something and you're out there hustling, and you're on public transport and you're going, you're doing what the system asks you to do. You're working hard. You've got a university degree. You're applying yourself. You look around at this social contract. Where are my taxes going? Why am I funding illegal migrants who are breaking our laws? Why am I funding the fact that nearly half of all social housing in London is going to households that are headed by people who were not even born in the UK and have literally included pro-Hamas organizers, terrorists and lieutenants? Why am I funding this social contract? And why is, if you're a top earner in this country, why is a third of all of my tax going to support a welfare regime that nobody is serious about reforming? Why would you stay in this social contract? Like, why would you stay in this system? Leaders aren't interested in listening to you. They're certainly not interested in respecting you. And that is why you're seeing these profound political changes. You've got reform on 34% in the latest polling. More than 1 in 3 Brits, more than 1 in 3 of every people out there on the street are now backing Nigel Farage and reform. That is how exasperated they are.
We'll come back to that. So you mentioned earlier that you think that when it comes to the Island of Strangers statement, that the people behind Starmer are looking at the statistics and going, we've got to do something about it. I was actually under a very different impression, which is that they see reform galloping up the polls and they think we've got to do something about that. Clearly, immigration, if it's not number one issue, it's number two. It's been number one or number two for decades now. They've got to do something if they want to stay in power and please the people. So for me, it seems like the actions don't suggest that they actually care about it. But for me, it seems like they're just kind of signaling this to kind of placate a base.
Yeah, they don't believe in it.
Yeah.
They're not going to fundamentally reform immigration. It's actually too late for Labour. Now it's too late for Keir Starmer. 1 year in, their support has collapsed. Starmer's ratings are utterly dismal. He's the most unpopular prime minister we've had in recent history. In fact, on record, he is, I think, in some polling, is even more unpopular than Liz Truss. And he is basically where Meghan Markle is. He is as disliked in this country as Meghan Markle, which is saying something. Nobody in Westminster tells you this because a lot of the journos are implicitly pro-Labour. This is one of the most unpopular governments we've ever had. It is completely out of its depth. We were told the adults were going to come back into the room. It turns out the adults didn't even know what they wanted to do with power. Keir Starmer's not even reading his speeches properly. So there is no serious plan here. So Labour are done. I really do believe that. And the Tories are done. If you look at the polling, on current polling, the Labour Party loses more seats to Reform than it lost to Boris Johnson in 2019. That is the scale of the assault on the Labour heartlands from Wales to Northern England to Northeast England that is coming over the next few years. Mm-hmm. That is what's going to happen. Runcorn and Helsby, the local elections, that's just the beginning. We're going to see a full-blown political revolt in this country, the likes of which this country has never seen since the rise of Labour, since Labour replaced the Liberals. But now what will happen is Reform will reshape the entire system because the system has not been listening and respecting to voters, respecting voters on this big issue of mass migration.
So it's worth noting for listeners that you have been openly campaigning for reform.
I've been speaking at reform events. So you very much publicly backing them. I view this movement as a long overdue, much needed correction to the system, and it's going to pull the system closer to the people. Which Brexit was supposed to do that. The elite class had an opportunity then. You can either listen to what the people are saying, or you can go and do what Boris Johnson and everybody else did, and you can do the opposite. The elite class chose not to listen to the people. In fact, Keir Starmer and others deliberately tried to overturn what the people asked for. So now,
lest we forget.
Now, through reform, as is always the case in this country, it is going to come down to the people to fix this country. It's often said Britain loses every battle except the last. The people will reassert themselves through this political revolt.
So let's talk about then what you would do about this immigration stuff if reform are in power, or maybe to put it differently, what reform should do. So you've already touched a little bit about the border crossings, but I don't think we've fully finished that conversation. So, for example, we must mention that Rishi Sunak paid the French 470 million in 2023. I think 480 million in 2023 to use drones or whatever to kind of stop the boats. But there's no indication to me that the French have done anything about it, and I don't think they've got any incentive to do so. I'd be interested whether Reform would want the money back and whether they'd ask for it back, whether they'd have any way of getting it back. But what we had James Glancy on the show, as a former Marine.
Yeah, I know James,
And he said that we send a private team to Calais and we destroy all the boats over there before they can even come over. And we say to the French, look, this is how you do it. Get on with it. He also suggested putting the Navy in the Channel. What would you do in real terms? You know, I suggest, given what you said earlier in this conversation, I imagine you'd say something equivalent to the Rwanda deal, or maybe it would be a different
just
location.
To be clear, you could do things on the surface like that. You could have a bigger military presence. You could send teams over to work with the French or humiliate the French. But what I'm saying fundamentally is, if you remove the incentives, the boats will not come. If it is made crystal clear that if you arrive illegally, you go immediately to an island, wherever that island is, and there are lots of potential islands we can look at. But if it is made crystal clear that if you come to the UK illegally, you will not stay in the UK, the boats will stop coming.
By the way, to support that argument, that's exactly what's happened since Trump was inaugurated at the end of January.
Of course.
Now, it's not. There's problems with how it's gone with Trump in terms of deportations, but it is the case that border crossings on the southern border, the states, has completely plummeted because the incentive is gone. People know, there's no point in going.
Absolutely, and we had some evidence, however imperfect Rwanda was, and it wasn't the final product. But we already had evidence in the early days and weeks that it was starting to make a difference, that you were beginning to see people going to Ireland instead, or revisiting their choice. We have never yet had an effective detain and deport strategy in this country. Labour say, we tried Rwanda. We didn't really try a detain and deport policy. The moment you do have that, the boats will stop. The moment you start deporting illegal migrants in the UK, many others will go.
So that's the thing I want to touch on then. There's 1.2 million illegal immigrants. By the way, there's another...
Well, the figure's disputed, but let's say if you look at the public utility companies, water companies and so on, they would estimate it's somewhere between 600,000 and 1 million. right? And a lot of those are in London. We've had that figure about 1 in every 13 people, based on the numbers. 1 in every 13 people in London is an illegal migrant. Yeah, as I wrote recently, London is over, right? I wrote a big piece recently. So if you look at all the evidence on London, sexual offences, robbery, shoplifting up 54%, property ownership down 20% on the early 90s, rents are up 85%. London as a kind of concept, I think London is kind of done. It's over. It's declining. It's invisible decline. It's impossible to get into if you're a hardworking, normal member of the public. There's a wall around it. It's expensive. It's not worth it. It's riddled with petty crime. 70,000 smartphones were stolen last year. There was, I think, a rape every hour, according to the numbers, which is absolutely crazy.
Wow.
Sexual offences against women and girls have never been higher. Of course, nobody in the elite class would ever talk about this because, London is a symbol of diversity.
Sorry, okay, let's say there's not 1.2 million, there's 600,000 to 1 million immigrants in Britain. How exactly are you going to get them out? What's the plan there? So we've seen in America, they've got the ICE,
Yeah.
and they're going around finding these people. They've misidentified some of them. It's been a little bit of controversy here and there, but generally speaking, they've taken a lot out.
And many others have gone voluntarily.
Many have gone voluntarily, and the Americans have a remigration policy, not forced remigration. It's
voluntary.
Voluntary. They're being paid a bit like the Swedes. That's part of the system. But it's also the case that the numbers, Trump's success hasn't been as good. That fewer people have been deported in this amount of time than under Biden and Obama. So he's actually not got the success rate in the actual deportations. He's disincentivized the crossings to America, but the deportations has been much harder than he's regained.
Firstly, he's regained control of the borders, which is what we need to do.
Of course, we need to do that.
90%. In terms of deportation, I would probably want to see, I think I would advocate something like what Sweden has done, whereby if we were able to solve the border crisis, or at least do a good job at dramatically strengthening our borders, we're currently spending every year somewhere between 7 and 10 billion pounds on the small boat crisis, somewhere between 7 and 10. So to put some context to that, Labour's welfare discussion and the rebellion over Labour's welfare plans, well, those were designed to save us about 5 billion, like a very small number. We are spanking 7 to 10 billion every year on the small boat crisis. So if we can solve that, we could take a portion of that money, or let's say some of the 13 billion that we're still spending on foreign aid, and we could run a kind of policy that encourages the voluntary removal of illegal migrants. That's one thing we could do. Mm-hmm. We could also just start using the institutions of the state, reforming the Home Office, most likely abolishing the Home Office and coming up with an entirely new department that includes a specific focus on tightening up the economy and removing people who are working in the economy illegally. We could have much bigger fines on the likes of Deliveroo and Just Eat, who are allowing illegal migrants in this country to rent passes to deliver food. There should be enormous fines on those companies for doing that. As the investigation has shown, if you come into Britain illegally, you can work within half an hour. You go on the Facebook groups, you go on the black market, you rent a Deliveroo pass from another driver.
Wow.
And for that week, you run around delivering pizzas and everything, and you arrived in the UK last week. That happens. Deliveroo and Just Eat, right, should have enormous financial consequences for that, because they are supporting the breakdown of our social contract, while also often avoiding paying tax or offshoring their tax into low tax jurisdictions. That is making a joke out of our country and social contract. So we can do a lot of things to make it much harder. And underneath all of this is this idea of a factory reset, and what we need in this country is a factory reset. When your smartphone becomes overloaded, tired, slow, it's a major source of stress. You've got too many apps, too many videos, whatever. You press the factory reset button. Our nation, the UK, Britain and England, has become slow, sluggish, inefficient, overloaded. We need a factory reset. We need to basically go back to where we were in terms of our legal and political architecture before the Blairite revolution in 1997. This isn't about rolling the clock back.
Some things need to go.
This is
you need to go further back.
Yeah, sure. We can talk, UN Refugee Convention and so on from the 50s. But what I think we need to do is say, I'm sorry, from 97 until today, we've tried this political revolution. It's divided our country. It's given us two-tier law, two-tier policing over our common law tradition and equality before the law. It's given us a divided society and a demoralized people. Yeah. It hasn't worked. So let's go back out of the ECHR, reform the Human Rights Act, reform the Equality Act, re-establish our common law tradition, equality before the law. Let's have a factory reset. We tried this, didn't work, evidence didn't support it. Now we're actually going to go back to what this country is all about: free speech, free expression, individual liberty. Hate laws go, with the exception of some laws in the 80s.
They had blasphemy laws then. So
sure, but we'll make it crystal clear, as some politicians have been doing through amendments. We're not having blasphemy laws in this country. More recent hate laws go, non-crime hate incidents go.
Clear it all out.
Nobody's going to prison for what they write on social media. It's
go back to
ridiculous.
Common laws.
Yeah. So let's do the factory reset. Now, I think if you explained it to people in those terms, I think they would say, you know what, actually, on balance, I'd be up for that. We'd obviously ring fence human rights, obviously ring fence a Good Friday Agreement, obviously ring fence some of the things that have been done post 97 that have been, useful. But what the Blairite revolution has given us, and what the Tories continued, mainstreamed and accelerated, particularly under David Cameron, but also more recently, what that revolution gave us was a political, legal system and a prevailing culture that has pushed this country into everything we see around us today. All of this decline, the chaos, the carnage, almost all of it, I would argue, has been encouraged and cultivated by that Blairite revolution.
Do you think that let's say reform win the general election, if we hear what Liz Truss has said about her problems with the blob, the deep state, and you think about the civil service and everything they do to hold up, because that is really what we're talking about, the Westminster bubble that would stop, even when it came to Brexit, that's what was slowing everything down. Even if reform get to government, are they actually going to be able to do these things?
If they're organised.
If they're organised.
Yeah. So everything we've talked about on this show today and previously, these are second order problems: mass immigration, broken borders, woke ideology, broken economy. These are all second order problems. The first order problem are the people who are running the British state. That's the first order problem, right? Whether you call it the regime, whether you call it the elite class, whether you call it the blob, the establishment, whatever. That's the first order problem. So my question then would be, okay, how do you put into place a plan for government, a plan for holding power that reshapes that bureaucracy, that completely reforms the state bureaucracy, right? And that means basically carving off the top layer of the civil service, having a detailed plan for political appointments, having a serious strategy for deconstructing the quangocracy, the numerous, countless public bodies that are not accountable to the British people but are happy to spend the British people's money on pushing a political agenda. How do you return our public taxpayer-funded institutions to being politically impartial, neutral institutions that are not enforcing liberal progressivism top-down on people, which is what the universities are doing. It's what the NHS, I would argue, is doing through gender medicine. It's what our schools are doing to our children. How do you get back to that? Now, until Reform or whoever have a serious plan for that, a bit like Trump has had a serious plan for that long before he came into office, right? You're not going to get that change. What I want to see in the UK, I don't want to see Trump 1. I want to see something similar to Trump 2. I want to see a shock and awe strategy that has been developed before the next general election is even held. Mm-hmm. Because if an anti-establishment movement comes into the UK state, comes into the British establishment in 2029, right, or 2028, unless that movement has a plan and the people around it who have been in government know where things are, know where the skeletons are, know what the hurdles are, know what the obstacles are, that movement is going to be completely pushed around, diluted, and overturned by the regime. That's a reality. And there's a bigger potential risk in all of that, which is this. For the first time in British history, the British people might be about to get behind a political insurgency that is from outside of the establishment, right? We've only really seen that with the rise of the Labour Party. This is going to be something completely different. So if this goes wrong, if the British people put their faith in this, having put their faith in Brexit, having put their faith in Boris, and this goes wrong, I do not know what the consequences of that will be. I think they will be very dark. I think it will be very, very troubling. I think you will either see mass apathy, people just completely giving up on the system, or you'll see something way darker. So there is an enormous amount of responsibility on the people who are involved in that revolt to get it right. It has to be done right. What's the plan for government? What's the first 100 days? Who are the political appointments? Who are the special advisors? How are you going to reform the state? How are you going to do that while reassuring the markets, right? Which is exactly what I would argue Liz Truss failed to do. And it needs to look a lot more like Trump 2 than Trump 1.
Do you think that there can be done anything about the two-tier justice in Britain? Because that really comes down to the courts and judiciary. And you mentioned a bit about the police, I guess, or is implicit in the sort of quangos. And so the College of Policing, for example, would be a quango that advised the police on everything from non-crime hate incidences to various policing protocol. What can be done with regards to the likes of a system where Lucy Connolly gets 2.5 years and these other rapists and other criminals are having lenient sentences?
There's a lot that can be done, is the short answer. So basically, again, a legacy of the Blairite Revolution is we've seen an expansion in what's called judicial activism, judicial reviews, whereby the legal system has become much more interventionist. It's become much more willing to get involved in politics, to basically push a political agenda. Even if lawyers and judges would say they wouldn't see it that way, for everybody else, it's pretty obvious that is what is going on. So we need to roll back the judicial activism in this country. There are lots of people much smarter than me who have suggested ways of doing that. We need to make it clear that we cannot have a politicized policing in this country, and we cannot have public institutions promoting political ideologies, right? Whether it's Black Lives Matter, critical race theory, all of that stuff, that extremist, radical, ideological gobbledygook that came out of the universities and was then embraced. And, Winston, a lot of this goes back to the Equality Act. Like, if you really want to get our institutions back to being neutral institutions that are just providing basic public services, like, I don't want police officers wearing rainbow lanyards as a symbol of that. I don't think police officers should be lecturing people about political ideologies or movements. I don't think that's the role of policing, and it's certainly not the role of things like the National Health Service to be promoting, unscientific ideologies. So much of it goes back to the Equality Act and the public sector duties that came out of that, where institutions were basically incentivized to embrace this divisive identity politics. It's why I keep saying, as do other people, all of this goes back to the Blairite Revolution. You have to deal with the root cause, because if you have a new government that comes in and says, yeah, we're going to, remove some of the welfare payments for illegal migrants, and we're going to, tinker around, and we're going to say, haul in the London Met chief and give them a lecture, whatever, that's not going to deal with the issue. The issue is we have to go back and fundamentally reform the legal and political architecture in this country. That's what we have to do. And the people who do it are going to have to be courageous, they're going to have to stand firm, and they're going to have to explain to the British people why they're doing these things, right? That we need a factory reset that will push us in a much better direction than the direction we're currently going in.
Another thing I wanted to ask, which it seems a bit of a riddle to me. So you paint a picture of somewhere like Luton, which is demographically drastically different, and isn't necessarily recognizable as an English town that it might have been 100 years ago or even 80 years ago. But even if you had a moratorium on immigration and there was zero zero gross migration.
Yeah, sure. Or even some net negative.
Even some net negative. You've got a town like Luton, and those who are of heritage other than British, who are there, might be administratively British or have become British since, but have these cultures that, as you described earlier in this conversation, are less compatible, and you said not compatible with Britain. How what do you do with regards to that in integration and assimilation? Is it the sort of case where we, like I think of the Italians and the Jews in America who really immigrated around 1900. It took about 3 generations for them to really become part of the American fabric. Is it a waiting game?
Yeah, but America was also a new nation. So the story of America is profoundly different from the story of Britain or the story of England or indeed the story of Europe. I mean, so America had to have a very different unifying story, which was essentially if you come here, work hard, you can chase the American dream. We have a very different cultural foundation here, even though our politicians would like us to think we're exactly the same as America. Look, the answer is this. From the 1960s to basically today, we have broadly followed a policy of state-backed multiculturalism. And that policy has been more focused on promoting group differences, promoting the different cultures, traditions, histories, beliefs, cultural practices of minority groups, while downplaying and suppressing or simply ignoring the identity, culture, and traditions of the majority group. So multiculturalism has failed, right? 15 years ago, David Cameron said that. 15 years ago, Nicolas Sarkozy said that. 15 years ago, even Angela Merkel said that. Now,
and that was an attempt, by the way, of the globalists to come up with the unifying...
But the key point in that is exactly that point, which is ever since we've had an open acknowledgement that multiculturalism has failed, when you have homegrown Islamist bombers, when you have the rape gangs, when you have people blowing up children at pop concerts, like it's obviously failed, nobody has had the courage in this country to come forward and say, this is the alternative to multiculturalism. This is a successor policy. This is what's going to follow this failed policy, and this is what's going to get our country in a much better position and make it healthy and strong again. Now, I would argue that that policy has to be some kind of Danish-style active assimilation, right? Whereby you freeze mass uncontrolled immigration for a long period of time so the country can absorb the change that has been unfolding over the last few years. Yes, you do things like deport illegal migrants and foreign criminals. Okay, I don't think people would dispute that. But you then need to put into place an activist interventionist policy of assimilation, like the Danes have done, where you make it clear we're not going to have 1 million people in this country who don't speak English. We're not going to be providing translation services through public institutions. We're not going to have highly segregated schools. We're not going to have a country where, according to people like Ed Hussein and his very important work, if you're a young British Muslim, you can spend your entire day never interacting with a member of the non-Muslim majority. We're not going to have this anymore. We're going to make sure our schools are mixed. We're going to make sure our institutions are prioritizing who we are in terms of language, in terms of culture, in terms of history. And we are going to actively intervene, a bit like Singapore has done, like Denmark has done, to break down segregation and parallel communities. We're going to also, by the way, come down much tougher on, let's say, things that enable Islamism in this country. No more Sharia courts, no more parallel legal systems, no more cousin marriage. I agree that we should ban cousin marriage in this country. No more radical preaching. If that's going on, then much bigger consequences. Shutting down on the enablers of Islamism. And we need to also look much more seriously at political sectarianism. We should not be having MPs who are spending more time campaigning for airports in Pakistan than are campaigning for issues and interests of British people here on these islands. That's not acceptable.
Okay, so
we can. What I'm saying is, forget multiculturalism. It's failed. We need a full-blown new policy framework that is about active assimilation.
Okay, so I've got a few questions. I'll try and take them one at a time. Singapore, you mentioned them. Now, they are, of course, a democracy, but they're not liberal. And you say they have various policies.
What I meant by that, take a policy like housing.
Yeah.
Singapore, mixed housing.
Mixed housing, but actually it's regulated housing. So each demographic, for each area, there's an assigned amount for each identity to have. That's right. So that's where they disperse. It's forced integration by dispersing people. And if you want to sell your apartment in a building, let's say, when at the end, you have to sell it to someone of the same race as you to maintain the demographics of the area. But that's all well and good for Singapore, and it seems to be working for Singapore because they're a very stable country with very little social issues compared to us, certainly. But it's not liberal. And Britain is a liberal, even conservatives.
It depends what you mean by liberal. I would say having a state that intervenes to correct a housing market that has become a hotbed of segregation and extremism, you could very well argue that is about defending the things that make a liberal society possible to begin with. Because in a situation where most, I can't remember the exact figure, but most Somalis in London are in social housing, it's not good for them. It's not good for the social housing market. And it's certainly not good for the British people who can't get housing in the capital city. That's not working. The fact that in places like Birmingham, Leicester, London, you have in some neighbourhoods, 60-70% of all social housing has gone to people who were not born in the UK, who don't even speak English. We have 300,000 people in London who don't speak English at all, and who don't identify as British or English as well.
Yeah, but
so the social contract is completely broken down. But if you have an activist state that intervenes and said, no, actually, the beginning principle of our housing market is British taxpayers, hard-working citizens who uphold the social contract, they go first, right? If you come to this country, you have to work to become part of this social contract. That's better for everybody. It's better for the people who come to our country, and it's better for the British people who've been paying into the collective pot for many years, if not for generations. We need an interventionist state. That's not about illiberalism. That is about saying the state has to now intervene because multiculturalism has been such a failure.
Yeah, okay, but it's fair enough, and I would support such a policy where you prioritise British people over newcomers.
Yeah, but
that's not the Singapore model. Sorry, the Singapore model is that it's actively separating groups from each other. So it would be more a natural parallel would be to say, okay, you got somewhere like Birmingham. There's too many of one group, and it's forming a sort of sectarian kind of new zone. You actually have to split these people up. We're going to send a bunch of you over here, a bunch of you over there. That would be the Singapore equivalent.
I wouldn't zoom too much on Singapore. It's what the Danes are doing.
Okay, I don't know the Dane story. You can tell me the Dane story.
So the Danes would say if there's a ghetto, if there is a no-go area that is dominated by whatever, Islamists, migrant gangs, whatever, the state will intervene, will basically remove that tower block, will intervene in that neighborhood, and will ensure that that scale of segregation is not allowed to carry on. Because Sweden, which took a very different approach, Sweden said, hands off, very liberal, live where you want, do what you want. Well, guess what? Now you've got ongoing bombings in Swedish cities by migrant gangs that have not integrated into the surrounding society. The reason I just said, well, what about universities, is take an example. People said, well, the universities will reform themselves on free speech. And actually they didn't. What the universities did is they chased out people like Kathleen Stock. They chased out people like Eric Kaufmann, and they basically became deeply intolerant institutions. The state had to intervene to level the playing field in the universities by creating the free speech higher education law, something I and others helped to design. In the same way, you can look at many other spheres of British life and say, this is no longer working. We cannot just leave these communities to themselves. We cannot leave these religious institutions to themselves. We cannot leave these cultural policies to themselves. The state will have to intervene in order to protect the social contract and make this nation state viable over the longer term. I don't think that's controversial. I think that is an obvious response to a failed policy. You know, we cannot have communities and neighborhoods in this country where they are not British anymore in any visible, meaningful, serious sense. They are not exhibiting the cultural practices, the rule of law, the belief in individual freedom, in women's rights, They do not exhibit anything that we would associate as being recognizable on these islands. Now, when that happens, the state has to intervene, including things like obvious things, symbols of that. Religious clothing, for example, would be something as well that
you want to ban the burqa.
Absolutely, 100%. Yeah, that's just a no. That's an easy thing for me. It's a no-brainer. I'm with Jack Straw and Labour politicians who have been reasonable on that issue in saying this is not going to build an integrated society. It's also a very visible physical display of misogyny and subordination. We're not having that. That's not part of our culture. And this is what Gareth Jones was saying. When you have mass migration, you have cultural transplant. You have the transplant of beliefs, religious identities and practices that aren't really anything to do with your nation, but they are transplanted in and they cascade down. It's why second, third generation British Muslims are often more radical than their fathers and grandfathers, parents and grandparents.
Burqas aren't part of our culture, correct. I'd actually go further. If you think about the 7/7 bombings and the Islamist attack, Islamist attack
took
in
the
this
train
country
from Luton, of course.
Is that right?
Mm-hmm.
I would actually say that it's not just not part of our culture, but it's actually, given what we've suffered from Islamism, it's a little bit offensive to hide your face in public. I would say that. However, what is also part of our culture is liberalism. And what we learnt, the religious wars, and we kind of came out of that in the 17th century with religious tolerance in a way that in Europe they didn't have the same sort of thing, which is why there are so many European countries that ban the burqa and have these rules, but they're much more used to the sort of Roman law approach of top-down controlling people. We, the British, have a very different bottom-up common law approach where this would be quite drastic. I think this would be quite. I'm not saying you're necessarily wrong that these are wearing a niqab. It's obviously not British, but it is also the case that to compel people how to wear goes against our tradition of freedom.
So let me be very, very clear. We are tolerating people who, in the end, will not tolerate us. That is the underlying point. We are allowing, particularly with Islamic
people or ideas
carried out by people. Islamism, the political ideology, is dogmatic. It's about control. It's about hijacking institutions. And it is about reshaping liberal Western societies around a particular set of illiberal, anti-Western ideas. We just need to be realistic about that. The failure of our political leaders to even be willing to talk about that, the refusal of Labour politicians to say why they were being intimidated, why they were being threatened, why they were being harassed, speaks to the weakness in our political class. It's very obvious what was happening at the last general election in particular parts of the country, like it was very obvious what happened to Sir David Amess and others, that people understandably are scared because they are talking about something that is instinctively dogmatic and it is fundamentalist. So I'm not interested actually in saying, well, we have a liberal tradition of standing back and letting people do whatever they want. No, we have a very specific problem that will require the state to intervene to fix that problem. Otherwise, we will not be a liberal society over the longer term.
Before we go over to take questions from the Substack followers, I've got a last question I want to ask you, which actually is a question to one of your statements. So you said earlier that multiculturalism as the unifying philosophy or identity or idea of Britain no longer works. But I've also noticed that a lot of British people struggle to define what it is to be British. We have got this problem of, even if we froze immigration, as we've already discussed, there are a lot of people here from other cultures. What is it, according to Matt Goodwin, what is the idea that unites us all? Where do you find, where is the sort of hope in uniting this country of strangers? Where is the positive vision of the future for Britain, according to you?
Well, the first thing I would say is we don't currently have a unifying story. The story that the elite class will tell us is diversity is our strength, and that the unifying story, what it means to be British, is about welcoming other people. That's the Sadiq Khan story. That's the Emily Maitlis story. That's the Keir Starmer story. That's the liberal progressive story. But if the only thing that defines a people is that they welcome other people, it is the same thing as saying those people have no identity of their own. They have no distinctive history. They have no distinctive culture. They have no distinctive way of life. They have no distinctive ethnicity or ancestry or collective memory. I reject that story because we are so much more than that story. We have our own story on these islands that is about the promotion of individual liberty, of free speech, of free expression. We have a story that is about fighting tyranny and dogmatism and fundamentalism. It is a story about building one of the greatest civilizations the world has ever known and being proud of those achievements and passing on that unique and remarkable cultural inheritance to other people. So the optimism is we now need to get back to that story and promote that story and revive that story and tell the people who are on these islands about that story and this remarkable civilization that they're a part of. And we want to push that back to the forefront. We're more than this globalist mush that is being pushed down on us by the political class. We're so much more than the 2012 Olympics. Like, we're so much more than that. Yet nobody in the political class seems willing to say that. And I think it's about time that the people in politics start to listen to the people out there in the country who can feel it instinctively. Every person on this island, I would say every Englishman, every English woman, knows what it is to be from these islands. They feel it. It's instinctive. They know it when they see it. And sometimes you don't want to put it into words because putting it into words makes it a little bit less valuable, makes it a little bit less special. But they know what it isn't. They know when they look at what's been happening in this country recently, they know that's not what it is. It's not Lucy Connolly. It's not the rape gangs. It's not the communities that we've talked about during this discussion. That's not what it is. Everybody knows what it is to come from these islands, I think. We need to get back to that story and tell it in an upbeat, optimistic, forward-looking way and look past this dreary narrative that the elite class is imposing on us.
Matt, on that note, thank you so much. Let's go and take questions.
Great.
On the Substack.
Thank you.
Thank you for watching the Winston Marshall Show with Matt Goodwin. If you head over to winstonmarshall.co.uk now, you will have an extended conversation between me and Matt where he takes your questions from Substack followers, which include what Matt thinks about Restore Britain, Rupert Lowe and Ben Habib's new party. It includes an extended conversation about English ethnicity, what it means to be English and British. You'll also get ad-free viewing over there. So, winstonmarshall.co.uk. Otherwise, until next time, be well.